This is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South. I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi, Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen in Chicago.
In the summer of 1966, segregation in Chicago was profound. African Americans were kept in slums with defined boundaries while whites prospered in separate neighborhoods. Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights activists decided to take their movement north to protest poverty in slums of northern cities, the worst of which were in Chicago. Planned marches through the all-white neighborhoods of Gage Park and Marquette Park raised awareness of segregation and racism in the North, and eventually resulted in an agreement with the city to enforce open housing laws. In the long term, the marches failed their ultimate goal, to racially integrate the city. Chicago is still one of the most segregated cities in America. However, they marked an important turning point for the civil rights movement in the North and were an important first step towards open housing in Chicago. After World War I, African Americans from the South moved north in great masses to Chicago and other industrial cities. Dozens of factories and steel mills were opening up in Chicago, primarily in the southeastern side. By the 1940s, the south side of Chicago, especially Bronzeville, was a heavily populated African American neighborhood. Black banks and stores sprung up all over, and one could vote for fellow African American political candidates. Bronzeville was a thriving neighborhood with ample and friendly businesses and services for residents. Blacks believed they could thrive side by side with whites in separate but equal areas of the city. People called this the Bronzeville attitude. In 1950, much began to change. As more and more blacks moved to the area from the South, Bronzeville became extremely overcrowded, but it could not expand due to strict and unwritten laws governing real estate and surrounding neighborhoods which were almost exclusively white. Surrounding white neighborhoods made deals with each other called restrictive covenants not to sell houses to black families. This scenario occurred all over the city, although it was concentrated in a few neighborhoods. In response to the high density of the population and the need for housing, Mayor Richard J. Daley backed the construction of massive housing projects in certain neighborhoods on the south side, further concentrating the black population into certain areas. Worse, these projects put blacks in the sky rather than on the ground, where it was much more comfortable.
The pain that the people had in the South was the same kind of pain that they had in Chicago.
After a decade of protest in the South for civil rights, Martin Luther King Jr. decided to take his movement to the North in 1966. King and other activists formed the Chicago Freedom Movement, which was set up to continue his nonviolent battle against racial inequality by focusing on poverty and slums in northern cities. In 1966, Gage Park on Chicago's south side was notorious for being all-white, consisting primarily of Irish, German, Lithuanian, and Russian immigrants, and resistant to any attempts by black buyers to buy homes within its boundaries. In 1960, there were 28,244 people in Gage Park, with only 2 being African American. One black family moved into Gage Park and their garage was burnt and their lives threatened. Mayor Richard J. Daley and others who controlled the real estate market tried to put housing projects in all-black neighborhoods, such as the area between 37th Street, Western Avenue, and 63rd Street. Martin Luther King Jr. was attuned to the situation that Chicago was in and wanted to convince political leaders to commit to open housing and to reduce segregation. In mid-July 1966, King and the Chicago Freedom Movement demanded that the city of Chicago take immediate action to end discrimination by realtors, bankers, and builders of low-income housing. Mayor Daley ignored these requests, so the activists had to confront the problem.
I do plan to stir up trouble in some of the big cities in our country this summer. But my stirring up trouble will be righteous trouble to bring about nonviolent solution.
In order to solve this problem, King had to confront the city through marches. These marches would cause political and economic issues, forcing the city to address the dispute. On August 5th, 1966, Martin Luther King Jr. and about 700 supporters gathered to participate in the first of a series of marches in all-white neighborhoods across the city to protest defiant segregation in Marquette Park and other parts of the city. They began to march peacefully through the streets, but the residents of this all-white enclave were furious. They barraged the marchers with bricks, rocks, and insults. Hundreds of people showed up to assault the protesters, carrying signs with hateful and racist messages, even some Nazi messages.
Riding our bikes there, and we rode by the Ku Klux Klan had a headquarters on 71st Street, and I saw that, and I had never seen that before. Later to find out my parents always rode around that, so I never had to look at that. So I see this Ku Klux Klan headquarters on 71st Street right off of Tallman. Then we go to Marquette Park, and we get there, and I see two things I never forgot. One was hate, like I had never seen in my life. People throwing rocks, bottles, turning over cars, screaming every kind of foul language, and every kind of racial language, and it scared me.
The hate of the whites was so evident it was alarming, even to King, who had marched across the South. Abruptly, King was hit in the head with a rock thrown by an angry bystander. King collapsed to one knee and was momentarily stunned and shaken, but recovered and continued the march.
So I'm in Marquette Park now, seeing all this hatred and all this anger and rage, seeing it from some people that I know that I'd never seen before. And then I'm waiting and waiting, and I didn't even know at that point that Dr. King had already been hit by a rock earlier in the march. And then they come walking by, and I see Dr. King turning to people in the crowd. And at the place that I was there, I couldn't hear everything he was saying, but he was saying, we have to learn how to live together. We're brothers and sisters. We're your brothers. We're your sisters. And I'm watching this, and he never, ever responded to this anger and this hate. And I didn't know how to respond. I didn't know he could do that. So when I left there riding my bike back home, I'm remembering in my mind saying, either this man is crazy or this man has some kind of power that I want to know about.
Several black drivers on nearby streets were attacked by rock-throwing residents, and police had to step in to protect them and others.
When we got back, the cars were burned, tires were slashed, all of that.
That day, 24 people were hurt and 27 were arrested. This was only the first in a series of many marches.
Negative reaction that occurred as a result of blacks being brought in as strike breakers in the Union stockyards fueled a lot of the resentment that later was transferred to generations of Chicagoans living on the South Side.
Concerned about mounting tensions during this and other marches in the next several days, Mayor Daley called for a summit meeting between King, leaders of the freedom movement, religious leaders, and others. After weeks of tense negotiations and only under the threat of continued marches, the city and the city's real estate board agreed that if the Chicago Freedom Movement stopped marching, the real estate board would end its resistance to open housing laws. However, King and black residents were dissatisfied with the outcome of Chicago marches. According to the agreement, blacks and other minorities were finally able to move into these white neighborhoods, but few did because even though the covenants were disbanded and open housing laws were supposedly enforced, the hatred of the residents was not altered. In the long run, the Chicago Freedom Movement and the open housing marches did not achieve their goals. Chicago is still one of the most segregated cities in the country. However, these marches raised awareness of segregation in the North, and as King noted wearily towards the end of the Chicago campaign, the marches and the agreement were the first step in a 1,000-mile journey.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man